Hey, good morning. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Tipping Point, Connecticut's first affordable housing conference series. My name is Kaylee Pratt. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Throughout the week, Partnership for Strong Communities is hosting over 30 sessions featuring local, state, and national experts, leading conversations to explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to addressing key affordable housing issues in our state. This session is the Legislative Roundtable session. We are very excited to be here. If you haven't followed us already on our social media, please follow us at PSC Housing and join the conversation at #TippingPoint2020. Before we get started, I would just like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Our leading sponsors for this conference are the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and Melville Charitable Trust. Collaborating sponsor, Connecticut Department of Housing, and our supporting sponsors, Housing Enterprises, Inc. and Whittlesey. I also want to take a moment to thank Penrose for their sponsorship of this session. A few housekeeping items before we begin, and I will stop sharing my screen here. The session is being recorded and will be made available following the presentation. All participants have entered muted and will remain on mute throughout the event. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the control panel on Zoom and direct any questions to me, Kaylee Pratt, or Chelsea Ross. Your presenters will let you know how they would like questions to be posed throughout the event. This can either be done in the chat or Q&A functions because this is a webinar, so there's the Q&A option in your control panel. And a few minutes before the end of the session, we will launch a poll that asks you for some feedback. Please take a moment to complete that. And as the webinar ends, you will also be directed to a poll. We're gathering information on affordable housing needs in the state in an effort to help us with our Home Connecticut restructure. Please take a few moments to take that poll as well. All right, that's all I have. So thank you so much for joining us again. And I'm going to turn it over to Kate Robinson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaylee. My name is Kate Robinson. I'm a lobbyist with Gallo and Robinson. And we are, under normal circumstances, co-located in the same building as the Partnership for Strong Communities at the Lyceum in Hartford. I want to welcome our panelists here this morning. I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction of everybody, and then I will ask kind of a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. Our goal is to have a robust discussion that's really centered on visioning as opposed to short-term planning, although I'm sure that some of our audience members will have questions about the upcoming legislative session. So I hope to have time to answer questions from our audience as well. First, I'd like to introduce Senator Saud Anwar. We call him Dr. Senator or Senator Dr. Anwar, and we're very glad that he's joining us this morning. He's the chair of the Housing Committee, the vice chair of the Public Health Committee, and serves on the Insurance and Children's Committees. He has served on his own town council and served as the mayor of South Windsor. He is a medical doctor, but also has a master's in public health. He has served on many humanitarian medical missions and peace missions internationally. And we're very fortunate that he brings both a macro sense, but also a very local sense to his leadership at the General Assembly. So welcome to Senator Anwar.
Thank you.
Representative Cristin McCarthy Vahey is joining us this morning from her little room in Fairfield. She's currently the chair of the Planning and Development Committee. Cristin is a member of the Permanent Commission on Economic Competitiveness, which analyzes the implications of state tax policy on business and industry in order to develop policy recommendations and promote economic growth and prosperity in the state. Cristin is a social worker and sees policy challenges through a problem-solving lens. And I want to thank her for joining us this morning. And Representative Brandon McGee from Hartford is the House Chair of the Housing Committee, and he is currently the chair of the legislature's Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. He serves on the Education and Human Services Committee as well. He is an advocate for equity in education, criminal justice reform, voter registration, and empowerment for people of color and their communities. Thank you very much, Brandon, for joining us today. And just so you know, Brandon, you're muted right now. That might be on purpose.
Yeah,
so,
as you can imagine, I'm doing a couple things, but I'm listening, but I'll be on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a couple of big picture questions to get us rolling, and I'll start by posing this question to Cristin McCarthy Vahey. Is there anything big picture that you would like to see happen as it relates to housing over the biennium, not just in the next session, but over the biennium? And I'm going to actually ask that question of each of you. So we'll start with Cristin, then we'll go to Senator Anwar, and then we'll go to Representative McGee.
Well, thank you, Kate. Thank you to the partnership. And it's really great to be here with Representative McGee and Senator Anwar. And I think we have some really significant opportunities and challenges ahead of us when it comes to housing. And it's interesting because a lot of times when we talk about this issue, zoning, planning, and housing are all kind of lumped into one, yet we have two separate committees. So I think one of the things that I'm hoping is that we can see those committees. You know, we're in the interim. We have a change in leadership in the House, so we're waiting to see what our assignments will be the next time. But in those committees, to see them working together to address these issues, we've had lots of groups, you know, having conversations around the state. And when I think about housing, and I know, Kate, this is one of your other questions, and I think about what has happened here at home in Fairfield and Fairfield County, but it's happening all over Connecticut and throughout the country with the change in where people are living and moving to, and the way that's impacting, for example, housing costs here in Fairfield County, which are already quite significant. The housing market's really hot, which means that I expect in 2021 that evictions are going to increase, that we are going to be dealing with more homelessness as a result. And we're going to be needing to address affordable housing even more than we already have. But when I think about this from a really broad level, I think about how are we addressing those housing needs from an economic development standpoint, from a safety net standpoint, from an equity, you know, social, racial, and economic equity standpoint. And I think we have to look at everything. I think the challenge that we're going to have, because there are so many ideas on the table, is which ones are we going to focus on given our new reality, our COVID reality. I could say a lot more, but I'll leave it there. I know there's so much to talk about.
There's a lot. Thank you, Cristin. Senator?
Thank you so much. So my job is easy. I just say whatever Cristin says and whatever Brandon say, I would agree with that. But I'll just add a couple of things. If I had a way to be able to look at some of the changes that we can achieve in the next couple of years, I'll list them into different categories. But one of the categories I think is very critical is to change the mindset of the general population in our state, because I see that the housing issues have been used to create division in our society in the recent few weeks we have seen. And the reality is that we live in the state of Connecticut, and there's a history for how we are where we are and what brought us to this point. And I would love for everybody to know that history, understand that history, and then recognize that, and also develop some empathy, recognition, and respect about what situation we are in and how we are going to get out of it. So that's part of a recognition and understanding that is actually, in my mind, not
Thank you very much. Representative McGee, what would you like to see related to housing in the next biennium?
Yeah, Kate, thank you so much for this opportunity to weigh in on such an important conversation. The privilege of going last is you can just concur with everyone who has already spoken. So I'll add one more piece to this puzzle, actually two. The first is acknowledging that, number one, Connecticut has a lot of work to do with respect to just having housing available to those throughout this state. In particular, those communities of color. We have to do a better job. The other piece is, and oftentimes we don't like to talk about this, so I'll be the one to kind of bring this up, is that we have to keep our long-term residents in mind when we're thinking about desegregating communities throughout the state of Connecticut. What do I mean by that? It's very simple. When we are trying to address the housing or the lack of housing opportunities for individuals in this state, the goal is not to just simply relocate people to what we've called high opportunity areas. The goal is to create opportunities for individuals to make that choice as to whether or not they want to move to a neighborhood that they're not familiar with or remain in a neighborhood and have quality options when it comes to housing. That means we have to support our municipalities, our commissioner, our housing authorities throughout this state, and we have to view this opportunity, I'm calling it, through the lenses of innovation. So again, I'm so glad to be here and look forward to this engaging conversation.
So Brandon, you've done a wonderful thing, right? The first shall be last and the last shall be first. So you get, and I know you're familiar with where that comes from. So,
and I'm actually at my church right now. We're having our virtual conference. So well said.
Okay. So, if you had, there's a song, If I Had $1 Million, but we have to right size it. If you had an additional $100 million on either the appropriation side or on the bonding side, what would be your vision for how to make investments and how to leverage investments that get us closer to a vision of access and affordability? Myself, I like to say when we're talking about affordable housing, if you can afford your rent or you can afford your mortgage, you are living in affordable housing, right? Because people are afraid of affordable housing, but we all live in it in one form or another, or many of us are privileged, I'll use that word too, many of us are privileged to live in affordable housing because we have something that matches our budget. But we know a lot of people, no matter how hard they work, they cannot catch up. And that's the structural problem we have. So Brandon, if you had $100 million, what would be your vision for that?
Yeah, for starters, that's a lot of money, and I hope we could find that money. But in all seriousness, I would, before we even allocate any funds, I would organize a meeting with many of our stakeholders. While that's the right thing to say politically, that is the most important thing that we have to consider, recognizing that organizations that are working on the ground understand how we should allocate the money. But if I had my way, I would, first of all, address our homeless population situation we have here in the state. Kudos to all of our organizations that provide direct service, right, to those who are most vulnerable and in need. But I would quickly arrange a meeting with many of our private philanthropic community to see if they could match those funds we have available, and then come up with a strategy that would help us to support affordable housing, those with criminal backgrounds. And y'all know I have been fighting for that particular population, by the way, who have served their time. They're living in our communities now. They vote and pay taxes. Why is it they don't have an opportunity to housing? So I would invest in that. The other piece is you got to think long term, and how do we sustain this large sum of money? And that's sort of the big question. Unfortunately, I wish I had the answer to it. So I'll save that for the doctor and our developer expert here, Cristin, and maybe you all can kind of add to this money, and hopefully we can get it. Kate, I know you've been around a while, so maybe you can help us to
shake that tree.
Shake it a little bit.
All right, Senator, would you like to share your vision for an extra $100 million?
Sure. So thank you so much, Kate, for this question. And I think it's a brilliant question. And I think we need to hopefully at least theoretically started to ask ourselves these questions and be able to show how we can get the highest ROI. This is public money, so we have to use it with respect. We have to use it in a manner where it's not a giveaway. It's actually a perpetuation of more revenue that can be created in a way as well. So we have to have strategies around that. First of all, while 100 million sounds like a reasonably big amount, I want you to keep this in mind that according to many estimates, the affordable housing needs in the state of Connecticut is about 120,000 more homes that are needed. So that comes to about, I was just doing the calculation, $833 per house. That's not enough. And so our needs are so much more significant in the state. And we have to figure out a strategy. How can we have this money go the farthest? So keep that concept in mind. And the second part is we have to understand the housing spectrum. The housing spectrum means that we have on one end of the spectrum, people who are homeless, and the opposite side of the spectrum is the market rate owned home ownership. So that's the entire spectrum. And in between that spectrum towards the lower end are the emergency shelters. We have transitional housing. We have permanent supportive housing and affordable rental. Now, I think the way to achieve this is to separate it out in such a manner where the affordable rental should have mechanisms to make it worthy for public-private partnerships to increase. If we increase the public-private partnerships, then we actually use our funding to actually join with private funding to be able to get us higher mileage. So we use that part as a principle. And then within that spectrum, we create a mechanism that resource becomes a perpetual way of continuing to support the transitional housing strategies, the homelessness management strategies, and so on. So that's where your 100 million will go farther out as much as we can. I don't want to use it on the upper end of the spectrum. That can be taken care of by the people and the market itself. We are supposed to be the voice for the voiceless, and we start to work on that mechanism to be able to do it. And this is doable, and it would be a good place to be at to have $100 million to be able to start some of this and create revenue sources going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think leveraging is a big part of what we try to do now. But you're right, having strategies to stretch out and make the money go as far as we can is something important to think about. Cristin, what would you do if you had an extra 100 million? I haven't heard anybody say anything about the appropriations side yet. Not that I'm leading you.
No, I have a laundry list. 100 million is a small amount of money. When I think about, 10 years ago when our local elementary school was rehabbed and rebuilt, it was close to 25 to $30 million. So it goes really quickly, and leveraging those funds is absolutely critical. We have to be in partnership with developers. I hear the term a lot here at home, predatory developers, and we've got to actually develop healthy, positive partnerships with developers who want to do this work in a positive way. So I couldn't agree with that more. I was on a call earlier this week with Sean Gio from the partnership, and he talked about plans and affordable housing plans. And I loved what he said, which is people can't live in plans. And I'll say that and acknowledge that that's true, but I also would love to see some of those funds used to help towns, especially those who have been reticent or struggled to come up with those plans to put in place, to do the planning and then help them put those plans into action in their community, a small piece of that money. I think that to the point of gaps, that we do need to invest in some of the development opportunities in the high opportunity communities. To Rep. McGee's point, we have to do concurrent planning where we're also investing in communities where there's the risk of people being displaced because of gentrification, for example. We need to put funds towards helping people with eviction. We are, again, this is going to be a crisis of epic proportions, I fear. And we're going to need to invest dollars to help folks with the legal process, but also in finding a place to live. We also want to be able to invest in helping those who are just ahead of that eviction process. A lot of times what we do is we wait until people are in crisis and then provide the help rather than preventing. That can save, people's lives, their livelihoods. Also, it can save money on the state side. And the last thing I'll say is, when we look at how to use those dollars, I'd like to look at the best practices and the things that we know work already. And I'm thinking, for example, about the Coordinated Access Network. I'm going to use Fairfield County as a phenomenal example of how that network has been leveraged so effectively to provide, that spectrum that you were talking about, Senator, of supports for people, and it works. So let's invest in the places where we know it works and that we've got the data to support it.
That's great. Thank you very much. I really am enjoying the sensation of the discussion because, it might be a little meta and denial in the denial place. So I'm going to bring us a little bit back to reality and short-term feedback loops that I think we're all experiencing. In your districts, how has COVID impacted the mindset about housing and how, it hasn't been that long, but so much has changed. And maybe we can start with Senator Anwar and then go to Representative McGee, and then we'll have Cristin finish.
Sure. Thank you again, Kate. This is again a very important question. First, I want to mention about the fact that the Department of Housing and the state of Connecticut has done an amazing, excellent job with respect to the homelessness aspect and the challenges that we would have expected or anticipated with the COVID. The reality is that in the shelters, the social distancing is next to impossible. So the Department of Housing, with funding from the state, but also from the CARES Act, have been able to have safe spaces for individuals with homelessness to be able to take care of them, which has truly saved thousands of lives. So I want to recognize that. But this also illustrates an issue. What it illustrates is that we did this because we did not want our healthcare system to be completely inundated with the most vulnerable in our society, just because it was a disaster. The reality is that every single day, our healthcare system is inundated with people who are vulnerable because we have not invested in prevention of their illnesses and challenges. So the actual COVID has literally highlighted the weakness that we have about the vulnerable community and their vulnerability and what it does to the healthcare and the entire system on the resources. So that's why it was placed in, because we did not want the ICUs to be filled with the homeless people. The reality is we need to build on this and have that same mindset. We don't have to wait for a disaster to tell us what's wrong with our society and start to invest in and taking care of them. What have I heard from the community? Even prior to the COVID, I would hear from the young people who would say, look, this is my home. I was born and raised and educated in Connecticut. I cannot afford a house in Connecticut, and I'm going to move away from here because I cannot afford to live here. Now, that's one segment of the population. The other segment is the early retirees. They would say, look, we want to retire. We love where we are, but it is the expenses and cost of living between the utility costs, between the cost of some of our expenses in the housing, those are contributing to people making choices against their will, against their desires. And I think that's where we will have to start to invest in this. So I'm hearing this left and right from people in the community, and we have a responsibility to address some of these aspects. And I know my colleagues will further enhance this conversation.
Representative McGee, how's COVID impacted your district and any discussion or outreach you're receiving from your constituents related to housing?
Yeah, great question. I'm in the same place, different location within the church. They're starting with a noon midday session, so I had to relocate. So excuse the messy office, but nonetheless, COVID has really highlighted the need for more housing opportunities for many of my constituents. Starting back in the start of this pandemic, I forget, I don't know if it was March or April, it just feels like a blur. But many of my folks were already one paycheck away from, just not making their rent. And contrary to, what folks think about areas like the north end of Hartford, there are a lot of homeowners who work in healthcare. And unfortunately, they've been impacted, as you can imagine, as well, serving as first responders. But it's really simple. The conditions that our people are living in communities like the one I represent is deplorable. It's horrible. And it's only highlighted the importance of holding our landlords accountable, supporting our landlords, supporting our homeowners to ensure, again, that those who may not have the privilege that we've been afforded, the opportunity to live in quality homes. So as you can imagine, my emails are always filled with, hey, Brandon, we need help. Are there any other COVID dollars coming down the pike for us to, be able to take care of our rent? I've also noticed an increase of very bad relationships between our tenant and our landlords. Landlords need to pay their mortgage, and some of the tenants are saying, well, I don't want to be a part of this program that the state offers, and you can't evict me. So what are you going to do about it? And so it's created this tension between many of my folks in the district. And I'm sure this is happening throughout the state. Mm-hmm. But I'm nervous, right? Because we're going through the second wave of this thing, and the resources, they're not there. And I'm concerned that municipalities don't have that money to spend in order to be reimbursed to support many of their residents. Homeowners have fallen short on paying their mortgage. And yes, there have been a lot of efforts put in place by the administration, by the folks within this Zoom call, and others to help to support, residents and homeowners. But the reality is it's going to get worse before it gets better. And trying to keep a positive, tone, it's becoming increasingly difficult because the realities, they're right there in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cristin, you and I were talking earlier this week, getting ready for this session this morning, and you were telling me about the hot market in your neighborhood, and that is one impact of COVID. Can you tell us a little bit about how COVID is impacting your district and what you're hearing from constituents?
Yes, and I will say, first of all, to all of the participants on here, I'm going to be listening to a lot of you, and I saw in one of the questions, how do we reach out? All three of us our information is available on the Connecticut General Assembly website, and we do want to hear from you. I know I can speak for Senator Anwar and Rep. McGee about that in terms of looking to you for solutions, because you're in the trenches. But to answer your question, Kate, we are seeing the great migration from New York. And when I was out knocking on doors for the campaign, I met lots of folks who had moved out of the city to come, here to Fairfield County. And I know that's, again, not just happening in Fairfield County. What has that meant practically speaking in the 133rd district very specifically, and even right here on my own street, is that houses are getting 10, 11, 12 offers on a house. And people are coming, some of the folks who are coming in are able to pay cash. What does that mean? It means that the folks who were renting a house here in my neighborhood had to find somewhere else to live, and there are very few rental properties available. So I've known folks who, have not been able to find anything in the district or in Fairfield where they maybe want to keep their kids in school, right? Because of course, we want to talk about education and housing and how that's tied, and folks often choose to move to Fairfield to be able to avail themselves of the excellent public schools we have. So I would suggest that the need for a diversity of housing stock in terms of affordability levels and also accessibility is even more important. As we see COVID impacting some of our seniors who are now on their own in very different ways and looking to try and downsize, and they have very limited options here. Those options are foreclosed upon, no pun intended, because of this market. And then I would say the other thing that my husband said to me this morning, COVID puts everything into sharp relief. And it has put the intensity of conversation around the creation of different housing options into sharp relief here in Fairfield, certainly, and throughout Fairfield County and throughout our nation. We saw this come up in the campaign. And, I know, if you haven't read Jacqueline Robb Thomas's work, she certainly has chronicled many of these conversations. But I say, when I started off in the beginning, talking about what we're going to need to do next session, I'm a social worker. I'm really interested in solving problems and listening to ideas. And what I have found is sometimes the way that the conversations have taken place have really not helped with that listening, because people have very strong feelings and strong ideas, sometimes based in lack of knowledge about either how housing funding works or what affordable housing will do to impact their property values. And there's, I think, back to what Senator Anwar said in the beginning, there's a lot of education to be done. But I found that in certain places that the temperature of that conversation has just increased, and the need for education and information and coming together to come up with real solutions and empowering the folks who maybe are afraid to speak up about what their needs are, to help give them a voice.
Yeah, Cristin, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that some of the housing issues, while probably a lot of us who are either listening or participating, we do pay attention to housing issues, but I think there's a lot of invisibility about the affordability crisis, that, people are doing what they can, or they're doubling up, or they're suffering and not sharing. And, to echo what your husband said, everything is really magnified because we're in a long-standing crisis. I think most of us had hoped that we'd be out of this crisis by now. But at this moment, I think we're probably at the 40% point if we're lucky, and we probably still have a ways to go. I'm interested in hearing from each of you, and I think I've asked each of you a question to start off so far, but maybe I'll start off with Cristin for this one, and then go to Brandon and have Senator Anwar finish. How much of the housing discussion is local, and how much of it is statewide? And how do you all kind of walk on that balance beam? Because, we have 169 towns and therefore 169 different ways of doing things, but we're a very small state. And so, Cristin, can you talk a little bit about that dynamic tension between being a state policymaker and a local representative?
Kate, all politics are local, and nothing is more local than housing. Unlike tolls, which was certainly a hot button issue last time, or even schools, housing is where we live. It's literally couldn't be more personal. So I think that this issue, I love how you talked about that balance, because it certainly impacts people where they are. And so there's a level of emotion around the issue that's unlike so many of the other issues that we talk about in the General Assembly. And yes, 169 communities makes it really tricky. You know, we had a bill in planning and development to provide some training for our local elected and appointed, largely volunteers, all volunteers who are helping to make these decisions and don't always have that framework. You know, the R word, right? Regionalization, or looking at things from a regional perspective. Whether that means, you know, working together or leveraging resources, as Senator Anwar talked about, is something that we have to be able to work together. Groups like CCM and COST, that's what they do. They help to leverage those resources, help educate community leaders so that we can work together and look at best practices. But it does become really, really challenging when you look at some of the local issues and then what we need to look at. You know, I'll just be quite open. Certainly there were a lot of comments during the campaign about, you know, me wanting to remove local control. That's a big conversation, right? Based on legislation that simply was trying to reorganize our zoning statutes and make it actually more accessible for those local volunteers and easier to understand and be organized. So it is a real balance. I always tell the fourth graders when I meet with them, the people who are my bosses are the people here in my district, but I also have the title state representative in my name. So we absolutely must look at things from both of those perspectives, and it is a big time balancing act.
Thank you very much. Representative McGee, you want to talk about the dynamic between state and local, and you know how those things work together or sometimes work in opposition to each other?
Yeah, Kate, you sure do know how to ask very difficult questions. I think, Cristin, you said it so beautifully. The balance that we have to strike as state officials and then local leaders. And you're right, all politics, they're local. And we start with the local challenges and interests of our constituency, which ultimately got us to where we are, right? Because we said we want to advocate. So having said that, for me, I am, as you've already mentioned, Kate, and you got a little feedback in the background, so excuse me, I'm trying to speak over it. But equity is very important to me. Having grown up in Hartford and through its housing authority, I know firsthand, you know, the need for us to address housing, but I also understand the importance of educating some of my colleagues who may not be familiar with the need for addressing housing in certain areas throughout the state. And so having that conversation, it's different, right? Depending on who you're talking to, whether it's in the halls of the state legislature or on the streets in some of our districts. But there is a long and very nasty history of segregation in this state. And we are leaders and we have to have those very uncomfortable conversations, but we're also charged with being responsible for the resources we have available to us, whether it's financially or addressing policy. We have to be able to address some of the long-term impacts some of these policies that are still in place that need to go away have had on many of our communities. So I don't think I've done a great job answering your question, but I do know that for me, oftentimes it's really hard for me to strike a balance. And I'll end on this note. There was an effort, and there's still a continued effort by a group that is working to desegregate Connecticut, which I applaud. But I've always been known to say, you cannot desegregate Connecticut without desegregating some of the communities that have been overlooked and under-resourced. And it's going to take allyship between the haves and the have-nots, and elected officials like those on this call to address the insufficient sort of resource around housing we have here in the state of Connecticut. So, but I'm looking forward to this session because I really believe, starting with the impacts of COVID and really diving deeper on the issue, we have that great opportunity during this upcoming session.
Thank you, Brandon. Senator Anwar, you've been a town councilor, you've been a mayor, now you're in a state senate position and a chairmanship position. Can you help us see through your perspective kind of the systems issues from the municipal side, and or the local advocacy or legislative side, and being a state legislator?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. This is a very important question. I think this is the question that should be magnified across our state to have this very important part. Look, I sometimes say this, that we are made up of 169 different countries, which are like small islands, as far as some people are concerned, because they feel that they love their towns, but they don't like their state. But they don't realize that they are part of the state. And one word is sustainability of a society. When people live or perceive themselves to be in these islands and they feel that they would control those islands and they don't want to do anything around those islands, it's not a sustainable or a healthy mindset for a society. Now, look, I've been fortunate to serve 2 terms as a mayor of town of South Windsor, which had the fastest economic growth in the region, one of the most affluent towns in our region. But even as a mayor, I was saying the things that I'm saying right now. So it's not like I'm wearing a different hat and I'm saying something different. The reality is that our economy is dependent on our cities. If you look at all the different people who go and work, 2,000 people from South Windsor go over to Hartford every day. These big companies are part of our economic engine as well. And the sustainability of those economic engines needs to be maintained. But at the same time, we need to recognize that the social challenges, political challenges, economic challenges that we are facing in some of those areas are very much ours. It's a matter of time they will come to us. Pick up any issue. Literally, when people were talking about gun violence, the inner cities were having gun violence. Nobody wanted to talk about it till it came to the suburbs. When you talk about drug-related challenges, opioid issues, nobody wanted to talk about it till it came to the suburbs. And that's unfortunate reality that we have is we are linked together. We can choose to close our eyes and not do anything about it, but it's very much our problem. Now, this is the public health point perspective, I would say, is that you cannot walk away any of these aspects and expect a good, healthy state, good, healthy economy, good, healthy, well-being committed. Also, another part that we have is a vulnerability for our state. That is, that these 169 towns are working in a manner where the rest of the country, only 2 states do not have county form of governments. And then this is what we have to realize, even to the point that when the federal government has to deal with the state of Connecticut, they have to figure out a new formula because Connecticut is one of the 2 states which does not have this, as a result of which they don't know how to deal with us. They don't know how to deal with FEMA-related issues with the state of Connecticut, because everybody else are organized themselves in a better way to reduce the cost to the people. So people want everything, but they don't want to pay for it, and you can't have it that way. That's a reality. If you want independent towns, independent libraries, independent everything, there's a price for it. And yes, it is a price we have as a state and then communities paid at this time. But then you do not get to complain about that at the same manner and say, look, you're doing this and this and this. Guess what? Look at the average pay of the various administrators in every town. You would be surprised that they are in bigger towns or important towns, if you will, or any town, you will realize they're at par with what the state pays to their administrators. So you have state within the state, and then you have the expenses within that part, and then you look at your entire expense and say it's expensive. Yes, but don't blame it on the state. Blame it on the system. So I'm sorry, but this is such an important aspect that is a solution to our future. We have to have these conversations. But thank you for this question.
Can
Looks like
I
Cristin
add
wants to
on?
follow.
I know I've been pretty compliant, we all have, but I just have to say, if COVID has not shown us how we are connected to one another and how our actions and where we live and how we live impacts one another, I don't know what will. It's a terrible and powerful illustration of how true that is. And I just wanted to emphasize, it is so true. We can think that we can insulate ourselves, but no matter what, we are only as well off together as our cities. And to you, Brandon, you talked about in particular, making sure that we are not overlooking the people who are struggling. I also just wanted to say one other thing in terms of that balance piece. Each one of us has been asked to serve in a leadership role as a chair of a committee to bring these conversations together. That means it's our responsibility to have these conversations. And yes, sometimes that does upset the people in our district, that there's an assumption, based on that, but that's our job. We've been asked and put in those positions by leadership to do just that, and we have to do that. I've been reading, it's been great to have take a little bit of time post-election to do some reading, and I've been reading some of the philosophers. We have to pose the questions. It's our job to ask the questions, pose the questions, dig into the issues, and have these uncomfortable conversations so that we can be better and do better and serve better and help protect and improve the lives of all of the people of the state.
So one of our people who's in the audience put forward a question about right to counsel for people facing eviction. We know that there are several people who are going through the eviction process right now because they were in the eviction process prior to the moratoriums that the governor and the CDC put in place. And we also know that people who have a lawyer or counsel fare better in those evictions, are better able to maintain their housing. Is this something that you see as part of the constellations of urgent needs, is making sure that people who will be facing evictions when those moratoriums expire have an opportunity to have legal advice or expertise to help them in the legal system related to their housing? It's a jump ball, anybody who wants to jump in.
I can start. I'm sadly expecting a tsunami of evictions that would happen after the moratorium. So we have to recognize there's going to be a balloon payment challenge that we will have to deal with. We'll have eviction increases because even if we put on the average monthly eviction cases that were there, if we just add them and forget about the COVID itself, we have a very significant burden that our communities will have to face. So we will have to come up with a solution and a strategy, and we'll have to have funding to prevent and take care of some of that help. I've already started to raise this concern with some of the people who are in positions of responsibility within the Department of Housing to say, please look at this aspect. We will have to address this. And if it's going to take a legislation, it would. Right now, the legal support is not there. And I'm dealing with some of those cases in my district where individuals who do not fulfill the moratorium of the state, but the CDC has a moratorium and they actually would be able to fulfill that. But you need a lawyer to be able to articulate that case. And I was asking our executive branch to say, include the CDC component in the picture so you make the lives of these people easy, but it's not been heard yet. So these are challenges where, think about it, our most important shelter in our lives is our homes. And right now there are people who are suffering and they don't have the knowledge to be able to address those. Lawyers are trained to be able to fight those fights. And A doctor cannot do that. Another person who's not trained in the legal profession cannot do that. So that's where we have a responsibility for the state to help out, but also I cannot thank some of the volunteers who are working hard to be able to take care of some of these individuals and giving them some hope of support. Thank you.
I want to jump in and just add, and I think Saud, you were touching on it a little, is we have paid legal individuals and organizations that they're already providing this support. It's just not enough to meet the demand, and so you have the legal aid support throughout the state, whether it's the Greater Hartford Legal Aid or others, they're there. Connecticut Fair Housing, they're there. And these are advocates. They're out there on the front line helping to support many of the folks who are experiencing foreclosure and need the legal support. So perhaps we need to look at funding more of these organizations who have been impacted by COVID, loss of income or revenue, and we need to support them. Whether it's COVID dollars or not, the need is great. And to underscore what Saud just said, it's important that we provide that support in anticipation of this balloon of foreclosures.
Right, and that stabilization now preventing much more expensive,
That's right.
Not only financially expensive, but great cost to individuals and families if we don't kind of do the prevention work on the front end. You all have been leaders and supporters around efforts to eradicate homelessness, improve housing quality and zoning reform. But we know that not everybody sees things the way you see things. Not all of your colleagues are in total alignment with the mission or the goals of a lot of the advocates who are participating today. Do you feel that the COVID crisis has increased and the increased focus on racial inequity has softened the position of people who don't necessarily see things the way we see them? Do you think it creates opportunities for a more productive discussion heading into the next legislative session? And I'll offer that up to anyone who wants to answer.
Well, I will start with that. I'm just going to lean down here. During the course of the campaign, I've kept this Wall Street Journal article from August that was by the president and Ben Carson about "We'll protect America's suburbs." And I'm just naming the elephant in the room that we have a lot of work to do in our nation and in our own communities and in our own state to talk about where these conversations are coming from and why. And it really goes back to Senator Dr. Anwar's comments in the beginning, and what both Rep. McGee and Senator Anwar have said. I don't know that it has softened. In a sense, I think in some ways it has hardened. And I was a youth minister before being a social worker. One of the things that I try to do is to seek first to understand, and to understand where people are coming from and why. In a call earlier this week with Senator Anwar, I mentioned Brene Brown, who's one of my favorite social workers, and talking about how we talk to one another, how we listen to one another. This is a very difficult topic for so many people, and folks come at it from different values and perspectives and experiences. And I want to help have, and if I'm a part of that conversation, want to be able to help us have conversations that name and educate and also understand, so that we know how we can have more of those conversations to get to those solutions. But I'm not convinced that it's softened things. I think in a way our anxiety level has gone up. We're all stressed. And when we're in the stress mode, our brains go into fight or flight. And we then have less of that neurocapacity to do solution making. So we've got a lot of work to do.
So does anybody else want to talk about the, how COVID has changed our lens and how your colleagues and our colleagues might perceive things differently now?
Yeah, I think again, Chris, thanks for the social worker hat and the teacher and the, Sunday school person, youth leader, like all of that combined. I really appreciate your response. For me, COVID, I think it's raised the profile on many of the issues that we've discussed, namely housing in this conversation, but just race relations in general and its impact on how we legislate, essentially. For me, it's very uncomfortable and exhausting. As a person of color, but also representing a very diverse district that's not just home to Black people, but home to all people, but also uplifting sort of the cries of those who have been so impacted for many years, disproportionately impacted. And so the reason I say COVID has created an opportunity in a very weird way, it's raised the profile of these issues that we've been able to just kind of put parking lot, if you would, for a little while, because that's just not my issue. But Saud said it earlier, and Chris, you said it as well. This is an everybody's issue, and we all have to reckon with our realities. But I do believe that it's made it more difficult because some of the priorities may not be priorities to some of our colleagues. And we have to be respectful, something that this current president does not understand. We have to speak our truth to power, but we have to be respectful. And we also have to be courageous in what it is that we plan to do. It's going to be tough for policymakers throughout this country, right? A lot of us, we won big, some of us lost, but it's going to be tough because we're talking about the stain of racism in our history and even here in the state of Connecticut. And it's not going to be erased overnight. I always tell people, but we can make some positive gains and stride to addressing what we've been talking about without having to go through it again. But yeah, so I'm excited, but I'm also very nervous. If I could be transparent with the 68 people on this call. Because people from my community, they're like, do more. And I'm like, whoa. So yeah,
we'll
like
all,
that.
We'll all take our vitamins. We'll all take our vitamins.
Well, I have strong coffee, so.
So I'm going to give Senator Anwar the last word because we are at 12:30 right now.
Okay, well, I'll just address this question. I'll just say that I used to joke with my colleagues in my town when I was serving as the mayor, that I said, look, I have deep respect for you and I love you all, except the last 2 months before the election, all of personality changes. So I'm hoping that our personalities will become who we really are after the election, and we will roll up our sleeves. Look, I think one of the things I love about our president-elect is that he says every time that he does not question the intention of the people he disagree with. And I think that's something we can learn from him because he articulates it beautifully, that I don't question and we should not question the intention of our colleagues, but we may disagree on how we approach the problem. And that is where it is going to be a way of ideas, and how do we address that, and how do we communicate those ideas and willingness to listen. There are anxieties, and there are legitimate anxieties about some of the policies that we are recommending, and that's where the data, because we are not the first ones recommending those policies, the others who have recommended those policies have seen good results. So some of those anxieties are unwarranted, in my opinion, and that's why I would love to have the conversation, and hopefully we will be in together as a part of the solution as one state. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I guess I'll let Kaylee bring us home. I want to thank all the panelists for making time for this robust discussion this morning. I really appreciated the opportunity to do some visioning in addition to problem solving. I think a lot of us on the call today really are working towards a more perfect union, but we all recognize that it means there's a lot of work to do. So we're grateful for your partnership in those efforts to make things better for the people of our state. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Representative McCarthy Vahey, Representative McGee, and Senator Anwar. And of course, Kate, thank you. We appreciate all of your time. And we hope to see many of the audience members join us for future sessions. Thank you,
I
everyone.
hope this is not the last. We need more of this. Take care.
Stay well, everybody. Thank you.
Take care. Stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.